The letter that was supposed to make me pay $1,800 ended up becoming the document that exposed the HOA's biggest mistake. Rebecca Caldwell thought she was sending a simple payment demand. She thought homeowners would see the HOA logo, read the deadline, and do exactly what they were told. What she did not expect was one homeowner opening the rulebook instead of his wallet. I still remember the afternoon the envelope arrived at my house outside Asheville, North Carolina. It was sitting on my kitchen counter among ordinary mail. I had lived at Willow Creek Estates for nearly 27 years, so receiving letters from the Homeowners Association was nothing unusual. Most of the time, they were simple announcements, community updates, maintenance schedules, neighborhood reminders. But this envelope felt different the moment I opened it. Inside was a notice from the HOA informing me that I owed a special assessment of $1,800. The letter explained the payment deadline. It explained the consequences of failing to pay. It explained that every homeowner was expected to contribute. But there was one thing missing. The reason. There was no detailed breakdown showing how the amount was calculated. There was no explanation of the specific expenses behind the charge. Most importantly, there was no clear reference showing where the HOA received the authority to create this assessment. It was simply a demand with a number attached. My name is Daniel Whitmore, and my property was never just a house to me. It was the place where my family built a lifetime of memories. My parents bought the land near the lake when Willow Creek was still a quiet area with fewer homes and fewer rules. Back then, neighbors knew each other. People helped each other. If someone needed assistance, they did not need a committee meeting before offering a hand. My father spent years improving that property. He built the workshop behind the house where he repaired old tools and worked on projects. He built the small dock near the lake because he loved peaceful mornings by the water. He planted trees along the edge of the land because he believed a home was something that continued growing with the people who cared for it. He also taught me something I never forgot. Rules only work when everyone respects them. That lesson stayed with me when I looked at the HOA notice. It was not that I refused to support the neighborhood. I understood communities needed cooperation. Roads needed maintenance. Shared spaces needed attention. Everyone had responsibilities. But responsibilities also came with expectations. If someone wanted me to pay $1,800, I believed I had the right to understand why. 3 days later, I attended the Willow Creek HOA meeting where Rebecca Caldwell planned to discuss the assessment. Rebecca had built a reputation as someone who was organized and confident. She always arrived early. She always carried the same leather folder. She always spoke with the certainty of someone who believed decisions were already complete before anyone questioned them. When the meeting started, Rebecca stood in front of the homeowners and explained that the assessment was necessary for the future of the community. This is about protecting everyone's investment, she said. Every homeowner benefits from Willow Creek, so every homeowner has a responsibility to contribute. Several people nodded. Some residents accepted the explanation immediately. Others looked around, waiting for more details. I stayed quiet. I was not there to create an argument. I was there because I wanted an answer. After the meeting ended, Rebecca approached me. "Daniel," she said, "I hope you understand this is not personal. The same rules apply to everyone." I held the assessment notice in my hand and asked a simple question. "Can you show me which section of the HOA documents gives the board authority to create this specific assessment?" For the first time that evening, Rebecca paused. It was brief, but I noticed it. "The board approved it," she replied. "That is how these decisions are made." I nodded. "I understand the board voted on it. I am asking where the documents give the board that authority." Rebecca looked at me and smiled slightly. "Sometimes homeowners make things more complicated than they need to be." That answer told me everything I needed to know. She had explained what the HOA wanted. She had not explained why the HOA had the power to do it. I thanked her and went home. That night, I opened the filing cabinet where I kept every important record connected to my property. Tax documents, old agreements, HOA paperwork, documents my father taught me never to throw away. I was not looking for a fight. I was not trying to embarrass anyone. I was looking for one thing: the truth behind the $1,800 demand. And somewhere inside those old records was a document Rebecca Caldwell never expected me to find. The next morning, I expected the HOA office to provide the explanation I had been asking for. I thought someone would send me the section of the governing documents that supported the assessment. I thought there would be a financial report showing exactly how Willow Creek Estates calculated the $1,800 amount. I thought Rebecca Caldwell would realize that homeowners were not refusing to cooperate. They were simply asking for the information they should have received from the beginning. Instead, I received another letter. I opened it at the same kitchen table where I had read the first notice. This time, there was no new information, no additional documents, no explanation of authority. It was only a reminder that payment was expected. The deadline was approaching. The HOA wanted compliance. I placed the letter beside the first one and stared at both pages. That was when I understood something important. The HOA was not answering the question. They were hoping the question would disappear. I sat there for a long time thinking about what to do next. I knew how quickly disagreements could create tension in a neighborhood. I had lived in Willow Creek for almost 3 decades. These were not strangers. These were people I saw walking around the lake, attending community events, and living their daily lives beside mine. The last thing I wanted was a conflict with my neighbors. But I also remembered something my father always said. Respecting rules does not mean ignoring questions. A few days later, Rebecca Caldwell called me directly. Her voice was calm and professional, but there was a confidence behind every word. It sounded like she expected the conversation to end the same way every other conversation had ended, with the homeowner accepting the board's decision. "Daniel, I wanted to make sure you received the updated assessment notice," she said. "I did," I replied. "I was hoping you could help me understand the charge." "Of course," Rebecca answered. "The community has expenses, and every homeowner has a responsibility to support those expenses." I understood that. I really did. A neighborhood required cooperation. Shared spaces needed care. Improvements cost money. But I asked the same question again. "Can you show me where the HOA documents authorize this specific assessment?" There was a pause. "The board approved it during the meeting," she said. "That is the process." "I understand the board voted on it," I replied. "But where do the documents give the board that authority?" This time, the silence lasted longer. "Daniel," she finally said, "sometimes homeowners make these situations more complicated than they need to be." I looked out the window toward the lake behind my house. I was not angry. I was simply realizing that Rebecca had answered the same way twice. She could explain what the HOA wanted to do. She still could not explain why the HOA had the right to do it. After the call ended, I decided to speak with some of my neighbors. I wanted to know if anyone else had received more information than I had. What I discovered surprised me. Several homeowners had questions too. They just never asked them. One neighbor told me he paid immediately because he did not want additional charges. Another said he assumed the board had already reviewed everything before sending the notice. Then I spoke with Mark Ellis, who lived a few houses away from me. Mark had also looked through the HOA documents. "I thought I was missing something," he told me. "There has to be a section somewhere that explains this." But after searching through the same records, he found the same problem. Nothing clearly gave the board the authority Rebecca claimed it had. That conversation changed the way I looked at the situation. This was not one homeowner refusing to help the community. This was a group of people being asked to accept a decision without being shown the foundation behind it. That weekend, I opened every file connected to my property and Willow Creek Estates. I reviewed the original declaration. I looked through old meeting records. I compared previous financial decisions with the new assessment notice. The difference was impossible to ignore. Earlier boards had explained major expenses before asking homeowners to contribute. They showed details. They provided information. They explained why a decision was necessary before expecting agreement. The new assessment worked differently. The demand came first. The explanation was supposed to come later. The more I searched, the more one question remained. Where exactly did this $1,800 charge come from? That was when I decided I needed someone who could review the documents without emotion. Someone who understood property law and HOA authority. I called Michael Harrington, a real estate attorney who had helped homeowners with similar situations. I sent him the assessment notice, the HOA declaration, and the meeting records. Before reviewing everything, Michael told me one thing. "Daniel, the first question we need to answer is not whether the assessment is expensive. The first question is whether they had the authority to create it." After I ended the call, I looked again at the letters sitting on my desk. A few days earlier, they were simply requests for money. Now they represented something much bigger. And somewhere inside those HOA documents was the answer Rebecca Caldwell never expected anyone to find. When Michael Harrington called me after reviewing the documents, I expected him to give me a simple answer. I thought he would either tell me that I had misunderstood the HOA rules or show me the section that clearly allowed Rebecca Caldwell and the board to create the $1,800 assessment. A simple explanation would have been the easiest outcome. I could have thanked him, paid the amount, and moved on. I never wanted a dispute with Willow Creek Estates. I wanted to enjoy my home, spend time near the lake, and live peacefully with my neighbors. But when Michael asked me to come to his office, I knew the situation was more serious than I first realized. "Daniel, there are a few things you need to see in person," he said. The next afternoon, I sat across from him while he organized the documents I had sent. The assessment notice was on top of the stack. Beside it were the HOA declaration, meeting records, financial documents, and older community decisions. Michael picked up the assessment notice and studied it carefully. "The first thing I noticed is what this document does not contain," he said. I looked at the paper again. "What do you mean?" I asked. He pointed to the amount printed near the top. "This tells homeowners what they owe. It tells them when payment is due. It tells them what happens if they do not pay. But it does not clearly explain the authority behind the charge." Hearing that confirmed what I had suspected from the beginning. The HOA had explained the demand. They had explained the deadline. But they had not explained why they had the power to create this specific obligation. Michael opened the Willow Creek Declaration documents and began walking me through the sections that covered regular dues, maintenance responsibilities, and community expenses. Those sections were clear. Homeowners understood their basic responsibilities when they joined the association. The HOA had certain duties. Residents had certain obligations. The documents created a system everyone agreed to follow. But when Michael searched for the section supporting this exact $1,800 assessment, he stopped. He looked at the page for a few seconds before turning it toward me. "This is where the problem begins," he said. "The board has authority, but that authority has limits." I leaned forward. "So what does that mean?" Michael tapped the document with his finger. "It means a board vote does not automatically create any power the board wants to use. The board can only do what the governing documents allow it to do." That changed the way I viewed everything. Until that moment, I had been focused on the amount. I had been thinking about the $1,800. But Michael showed me that the number was only the surface issue. The real question was whether the HOA had followed its own rules before expecting homeowners to follow them. Over the next several days, Michael continued reviewing the records. He focused on the meeting where Rebecca and the board approved the assessment. On paper, everything looked official. There was a meeting date. There were board members present. There was a recorded vote. Someone looking quickly at the records might assume everything was handled properly. But Michael noticed something important when he compared the meeting process with the requirements inside the HOA documents. Homeowners were supposed to receive enough information before major financial decisions were made. They were supposed to understand the purpose of the expense. They were supposed to understand how the amount was calculated. They were supposed to have enough information to participate meaningfully in the process. According to Michael's review, that information was not provided before the vote happened. "The final vote is only one moment," he explained. "The steps before that vote are what give the decision legitimacy." I thought back to Rebecca standing in front of the homeowners during that first meeting. She spoke with complete confidence. She said the assessment was necessary. She said everyone had a responsibility. She made it sound like the board's decision was the final answer. But now I wondered if that confidence came from understanding the rules or from believing nobody would challenge them. A few days later, Mark Ellis stopped by my house. He had continued reviewing the documents himself. "Daniel, I found something strange," he said. "The more I look through these records, the more it seems like the HOA changed the process this time." I asked him what he meant. He explained that older decisions included more information before homeowners were asked to contribute. Residents were given details first. They were allowed to understand the reason behind the decision before being asked to accept it. That was different from what happened with the $1,800 assessment. After Mark left, I placed the documents back into the folder on my desk. The assessment notice was still only one page. But behind that one page was a much larger question. Rebecca believed that board's decision was enough. She believed homeowners would accept the demand because it came from the HOA. But the documents were showing something different. Authority was not created by confidence. It was not created by a title. It was created by following the rules that gave that authority meaning. And Michael was getting closer to finding the one document that could change everything. After my meeting with Michael Harrington, I started looking at the entire situation differently. At first, I thought the problem was simply about an $1,800 assessment. I thought maybe the HOA had made a mistake. Maybe Rebecca Caldwell had information I did not have. Maybe there was a section in the documents that explained everything. But after reviewing the records with Michael, I understood something important. The assessment was only the beginning. The real issue was whether the people enforcing the rules had followed those same rules themselves. That thought stayed with me as I went through old documents from my property. Sitting at my desk surrounded by years of records, I found myself thinking about my father and the lessons he left behind. He was the reason I kept everything. He never believed paperwork was just paperwork. To him, documents told the story behind decisions. He kept receipts, agreements, letters, and anything connected to the house. He used to tell me, "A good memory helps you remember what happened. A good document helps you prove it." At the time, I thought he was simply being careful. Years later, I understood exactly why he lived that way. My property outside Asheville, North Carolina, was never just a house. It was the place where my family built a lifetime of memories. When my parents first bought the land near the lake, Willow Creek was a completely different community. There were fewer homes. There were fewer meetings. Neighbors knew each other. People helped each other because they wanted to, not because a rule required them to. My father spent years improving that property. He built the workshop behind the house where he repaired old tools and worked on projects. He built the small dock near the water because he loved quiet mornings by the lake. He planted trees along the edge of the property because he believed a home should continue becoming better with time. Every part of that land represented effort, patience, and memories. That was why the assessment notice bothered me. It was not because I believed I was different from everyone else. I understood that communities required cooperation. Roads needed maintenance. Shared spaces needed attention. Neighborhoods only worked when people contributed. But contribution required trust. And trust required transparency. If the HOA wanted homeowners to contribute $1,800, homeowners deserved to understand exactly why. While reviewing old HOA records, I began comparing the new assessment process with decisions made by previous boards. What I found surprised me. Earlier boards handled major financial decisions differently. They explained the reason behind expenses before asking homeowners to contribute. They provided details. They showed estimates. They gave residents enough information to understand what was happening before any final decision was made. The new assessment followed a different pattern. The amount came first. The explanation came later. When Michael called me again, I told him what I had discovered. He listened carefully before answering. "Daniel, this is important," he said, "because it shows the HOA already understood the proper process. They cannot say they did not know how to provide information when their own history shows they had done it before." That was the first time I realized the issue was bigger than a missing explanation. The HOA had created a standard in the past. They had shown homeowners what transparency looked like. Then, when Rebecca Caldwell approved the $1,800 assessment, that standard disappeared. I thought back to the first meeting. Rebecca stood in front of the room with complete confidence. She spoke as if the board's decision itself was enough. She never showed homeowners the document that gave the board authority. She never explained why this assessment followed a different process from previous decisions. She simply expected everyone to accept the outcome. Meanwhile, Rebecca continued sending updates to residents. Her messages focused on responsibility. She talked about protecting property values. She talked about supporting the future of Willow Creek. But homeowners were still waiting for the same thing they had requested from the beginning. The document behind the decision. The explanation before the demand. One evening, Michael called me with an update. His voice sounded more serious than usual. "Daniel, I found something else in the records," he said. "Something that changes how we approach this." I sat up and listened. "What did you find?" I asked. There was a short pause before he answered. "A document that shows exactly how the HOA was supposed to handle this type of decision." I looked across my desk at the assessment notice that started everything. One envelope, one demand, one unanswered question. But now Michael had found the piece of evidence that could show whether Rebecca Caldwell had made a mistake or whether the entire board had ignored the rules they were responsible for protecting. And for the first time, I realized the next conversation with the HOA would not be about whether homeowners should pay. It would be about whether the board had the authority to ask in the first place. The next morning, Michael Harrington asked me to come back to his office because he wanted to show me the document he had found. When I arrived, I could tell immediately that something had changed. The previous meetings had been about questions. This meeting was about evidence. Michael placed a folder on his desk and opened it carefully. Inside was an older HOA record from Willow Creek Estates. It was not a random document. It was a previous assessment approval from years earlier, created by a different board. "Daniel, this is the document that changes everything," Michael said. I looked through the pages. At first, it appeared to be a normal community decision. But as I read further, I noticed the difference. The previous board had followed a completely different process. Before asking homeowners for additional money, they provided detailed information. They explained the purpose of the expense. They showed how the amount was calculated. They gave residents time to review the information before the board made a final decision. Michael pointed to a section near the bottom of the page. "Look here," he said. "This is important." The document referenced the same governing rules Rebecca Caldwell relied on when defending the new assessment. But the interpretation was different. The older board had understood that authority came with responsibility. They knew that having the ability to make decisions did not remove the obligation to explain those decisions. I looked back at the $1,800 assessment notice sitting on the desk. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The previous board gave homeowners information first. Rebecca's board gave homeowners a demand first. Michael leaned back in his chair. "This is the strongest evidence we have," he said, "because it shows the HOA already knew what a proper process looked like." That was the moment everything became clearer. The problem was not that the rules were confusing. The problem was not that the HOA had no experience handling major expenses. The problem was that the board used a different standard when creating this assessment. They knew what transparency looked like. They had done it before. They simply did not do it this time. Michael began preparing the formal response letter. He explained that the goal was not to accuse Rebecca Caldwell or create unnecessary conflict. The goal was to place the evidence in front of the board and require them to address the actual issue. "We are not arguing about whether the community has expenses," Michael said. "We are asking whether the HOA followed the process required before creating this obligation." That distinction mattered, because the HOA had spent weeks explaining why the neighborhood needed money. But the real question was whether the board had followed the rules before asking homeowners to provide it. The letter was built around the documents. It explained the timeline. It referenced the assessment notice. It referenced the board meeting. It referenced the previous HOA decision that showed how major financial actions had been handled correctly in the past. Then it made the request. The HOA needed to pause the assessment and provide documentation, showing the authority behind the charge and the process used to approve it. There were no emotional accusations, no claims about personal motives, no attacks against Rebecca, just facts. Before the letter was sent, I asked Michael one question. "Do you think they will admit they made a mistake?" He looked at the folder of documents and smiled slightly. "Daniel, organizations do not always admit mistakes immediately, but documents have a way of making people answer questions they would rather avoid." The letter was delivered on Tuesday morning. For the first few hours, nothing happened. I continued with my normal routine. I worked around the house. I walked near the lake. I tried not to think about what the HOA might do next. Then, that afternoon, homeowners received a message from Willow Creek Estates. The wording was different from every previous message. The HOA announced that the board was reviewing concerns regarding the assessment process. That sentence was small, but everyone noticed it. A few weeks earlier, Rebecca had spoken as if the assessment was finished. The board approved it. Payment was required. The discussion was over. Now the board was reviewing the process behind its own decision. Mark Ellis called me that evening. "Daniel, did you see the message?" he asked. "Everyone is talking about it." I told him I had seen it. "It feels different," he said. "Before, they were telling people what was happening. Now they are explaining what they are looking into." He was right. Something had shifted. The HOA was no longer controlling the conversation. The documents were. And for the first time since the assessment notice arrived, Rebecca Caldwell and the board had to answer the question they had avoided from the beginning. Not why they wanted the money. Not why the community needed improvements. But whether they had the authority to demand it at all. The morning Michael Harrington sent the formal response to Willow Creek Estates, he asked me to stop by his office one more time before the letter was delivered. When I arrived, the final document was sitting on his desk beside the folder containing every record we had reviewed. Michael looked at the papers for a moment before handing them to me. "Daniel, I want you to remember something," he said. "This letter is not about attacking the HOA. It is about forcing the conversation back to the documents." That was exactly what I wanted. I never wanted Rebecca Caldwell to become my enemy. I never wanted my neighbors divided into different groups. I never wanted Willow Creek to become a place where every conversation turned into an argument. I wanted the same thing I had wanted from the beginning. A clear answer supported by the rules everyone was expected to follow. I read through the letter carefully. The first section explained the timeline, the assessment notice, the HOA meeting, the board approval, the demand that homeowners contribute $1,800. Then it explained the concerns. The letter stated that the HOA had requested payment before providing enough information about the authority behind the assessment and the process used to create it. It referenced the previous assessment document from the older board. It explained that Willow Creek had already established a standard for handling major financial decisions. It requested that the current assessment be paused until the HOA could provide documentation showing that the board had properly followed the required process. There was no emotional language, no accusations, no attempt to make Rebecca look dishonest. It simply placed the facts in front of the people who made the decision. Michael explained why that approach mattered. "The strongest argument is the one that does not need exaggeration," he said. "If the documents support them, they can show that. If they do not, the documents will show that too." The letter was delivered on Tuesday morning. For several hours, nothing happened. I continued my normal routine. I worked around the house. I checked on the garden. I walked near the lake behind my property. But in the back of my mind, I kept wondering how Rebecca and the board would respond. Then, later that afternoon, every homeowner received a message from Willow Creek Estates. The wording immediately caught people's attention. It said the board was reviewing concerns regarding the assessment process and would provide additional information after completing that review. That was the first sign that the situation had changed. A few weeks earlier, Rebecca had presented the assessment as finished. The board approved it. Payment was expected. The conversation was over. Now the same board was reviewing the process behind its own decision. The next HOA meeting became the largest gathering Willow Creek had seen in years. Homeowners arrived carrying copies of the governing documents. Some brought printed emails. Others had written down questions they wanted answered. The room was not filled with anger. It was filled with people who finally understood that information mattered. Rebecca Caldwell walked into the clubhouse carrying her familiar leather folder. But this time, she did not enter the room with the same certainty she had shown during the first meeting. She knew homeowners had read the documents. She knew people were no longer relying only on the board's explanation. When the meeting began, Rebecca addressed the residents. "The board has received legal correspondence and has taken time to review the concerns raised by homeowners," she said. "We believe the assessment was created in the best interest of the community, but we understand there are questions regarding the process." That was a different tone from before. A homeowner near the front raised his hand. "Can you show us the section of the HOA documents that authorizes this specific assessment?" The room became quiet. Rebecca looked down at her notes. "The board acted based on its interpretation of the governing documents," she answered. It was a careful response, but everyone noticed the difference. She was no longer saying the matter was simple. She was explaining an interpretation. Another homeowner asked why residents were not provided the same level of detail that previous boards had provided before approving financial decisions. Another asked why the older assessment process included documentation before payment was requested. The questions were not emotional. They were specific, and that made them harder to dismiss. Then Thomas Bennett, one of the board members, spoke. Until that moment, he had remained mostly silent. "I think we need to separate two issues," he said. "The goal of the assessment and the process used to create it." The room became still, because that statement came from inside the board itself. For the first time, a board member acknowledged what homeowners had been saying. The purpose might have been reasonable, but the process still had to follow the rules. After the meeting ended, Michael called me. I told him what happened. He was quiet for a moment before responding. "Daniel, this is exactly why the letter was necessary." It changed the conversation from opinion to evidence. Over the next several days, the HOA extended the payment deadline while the board continued reviewing the records. Homeowners who had already paid started asking what would happen next. Residents who had stayed silent before began requesting copies of the same documents Michael had examined. The assessment had become something completely different from what Rebecca intended. She thought she was sending a payment request to a homeowner who would eventually comply. Instead, she created the moment when an entire neighborhood started examining the rules. But Michael reminded me that the final answer had not arrived yet. The important part is not whether they feel pressured, he said. The important part is whether the evidence changes their decision. And now everyone at Willow Creek was waiting for the board's final response. The week after the HOA meeting, Willow Creek Estates entered a period nobody expected. For the first time since Rebecca Caldwell announced the $1,800 assessment, the board was no longer controlling the conversation. The documents were. Homeowners who had never looked at the HOA rules before were now reading them carefully. They were comparing old decisions with the current assessment. They were asking questions that should have been answered before the first notice was ever sent. A few days after the meeting, Michael Harrington called me with an update. "Daniel, the HOA provided additional records," he said. "But there is something important about what they sent." I asked him what he found. "They are explaining why they wanted the assessment. They are still not proving where the authority comes from." That was the same issue we had identified from the beginning. The HOA could explain the goal. They could explain the community improvements. They could explain why the neighborhood might need additional funds. But they still had not answered the most important question. What gave the board the power to create this specific charge? Michael continued reviewing the documents and found another detail that made the situation even clearer. The section Rebecca had relied on when defending the assessment was not a blank check for the board. It gave the HOA certain responsibilities, but it also required the board to follow specific procedures before creating major financial obligations. The same document Rebecca used to defend her authority actually showed the limits of that authority. When Michael showed me that section, I immediately understood why the board had avoided discussing it. "Daniel," he said, "this is the turning point. The rule they are relying on is the same rule that requires them to follow a process they skipped." That was the legal discovery we had been waiting for. The issue was no longer just about missing information. The issue was that the HOA's own documents created a standard the board had failed to meet. The next HOA meeting became the most important gathering Willow Creek had seen in years. Homeowners arrived early. They brought copies of the declaration documents. They brought notes from previous meetings. They were prepared. But the atmosphere was not hostile. People were not there to attack Rebecca or the board. They were there because they finally understood that rules only worked when everyone respected them. Rebecca Caldwell walked into the clubhouse carrying her leather folder. But this time, she was different. She was more careful with her words. She knew homeowners had reviewed the same documents Michael had reviewed. She knew people were no longer simply accepting the board's explanation. When the meeting began, Rebecca addressed the residents. "The board has completed additional review of the assessment process," she said. "We believe the original decision was made with the best interests of the community in mind." Then Mark Ellis raised his hand. "I do not think anyone is questioning the goal," he said. "The question is whether the process followed the rules." The room became quiet, because that was the exact question everyone wanted answered. Rebecca looked through her notes. "The board acted based on its interpretation of the governing documents," she replied. But this time, homeowners noticed something. The answer was different from before. She was no longer saying the decision was obviously correct. She was saying it was based on an interpretation. Then another homeowner stood and asked, "If the board had authority to create this assessment, why was the process different from previous assessments approved by Willow Creek?" Rebecca paused. She looked toward the other board members. Nobody answered immediately. Then Thomas Bennett spoke. "That is a fair question," he said. "The previous process included more documentation before homeowners were asked to contribute." That statement changed the room, because it was not coming from a homeowner. It was coming from inside the board. For the first time, someone within the HOA acknowledged that the standard had changed. Michael called me after the meeting and explained why that moment mattered. "Daniel, the board is no longer defending only the outcome. They are recognizing that the process is the issue." Over the next several days, the HOA continued reviewing the records. The payment deadline remained paused. Homeowners who had already paid waited for information about what would happen next. Residents who had stayed quiet before began requesting copies of the documents. The situation had completely reversed. In the beginning, Rebecca believed the board held all the authority because it made the decision. Now the board was being asked to prove that the decision was made within the authority the documents provided. And then Michael found one final piece of information. It was a record from the original formation of Willow Creek Estates. A document that explained why the HOA rules were written the way they were. It showed that the purpose of those rules was not to give the board unlimited power. It was to create balance between community management and homeowner rights. When Michael showed me that document, I realized something important. The HOA had forgotten the reason those rules existed in the first place. They were not created to make homeowners silent. They were created to make decisions fair. And now Rebecca Caldwell had to decide whether she would continue defending a decision that the documents were questioning or admit that the process needed to change. The final HOA meeting regarding the $1,800 assessment was scheduled for a Thursday evening, and by then, everyone at Willow Creek Estates knew something important was about to happen. The same homeowners who once ignored HOA announcements were now paying close attention. They were reading the documents. They were reviewing old records. They were asking questions before accepting decisions. When I arrived at the clubhouse, the atmosphere felt completely different from the first meeting. There was no frustration. There was no confusion. There was simply a room full of people who now understood that the details mattered. Nobody was there to attack the HOA. Nobody was there to create conflict. Everyone was there because they wanted the same thing. A decision that followed the rules. Rebecca Caldwell entered the room carrying her familiar leather folder. But this time, she did not walk in with the same certainty she had shown weeks earlier. During the first meeting, she had spoken as if the assessment was already finished. The board approved it. Homeowners had to pay. The discussion was over. This time, she knew every person in that room had read the documents. She knew homeowners were no longer relying only on the board's explanation. When the meeting began, Rebecca stood at the front of the room and addressed the residents. The board has completed its review of the assessment process, she said. We have considered the concerns raised by homeowners and reviewed the supporting documentation. The room remained quiet. Everyone waited. Then Rebecca continued. After reviewing the records, the board has decided to withdraw the current $1,800 assessment. For several seconds, nobody reacted. The silence was not because people were confused. It was because everyone understood what had just happened. The payment demand that started everything was gone. But the most important part was not the cancellation of the assessment. It was the reason behind the decision. The HOA was no longer defending the original process as complete. The board was acknowledging that something about the process had not been handled correctly. Thomas Bennett spoke next. He explained that the board had reviewed the governing documents, previous assessment decisions, and homeowner concerns. He admitted that the board should have provided more information before approving a major financial obligation. He explained that future assessments would include clearer documentation, detailed explanations, and more time for homeowners to review important decisions before any vote took place. Nobody interrupted him, because this was the moment many residents had been waiting for. Not an apology for having expenses, not a promise to stop managing the community, acknowledgement that the process mattered. After the meeting ended, I stepped outside the clubhouse with Mark Ellis. We watched neighbors leaving and discussing what had happened. Mark looked back at the building and shook his head. You know what is interesting, he said. The whole time, people were willing to listen. They just wanted the HOA to show them the rules. That sentence stayed with me, because it explained everything. The conflict was never really about $1,800. It was about trust. It was about whether homeowners could expect the same level of responsibility from the people enforcing the rules as the HOA expected from everyone else. A few days later, Willow Creek sent a written update to all residents. But this message was completely different from the first assessment notice. The original letter demanded payment. The new message explained changes. It described how future financial decisions would be handled. It explained that homeowners would receive supporting documents before major votes. It showed that the board finally understood something important. Authority did not come from making a decision. Authority came from making decisions according to the rules. Michael called me after the update was sent. Daniel, this is the outcome we were looking for, he said. Not because the HOA lost, because the process improved. I thought about those words for a long time. He was right. The goal was never to destroy Willow Creek Estates. It was never to embarrass Rebecca Caldwell. It was never about proving that one person was better than another. It was about making sure the rules protected everyone equally. Looking back, the biggest moment was not when Rebecca withdrew the assessment. It was earlier. It was the moment I opened that first envelope and decided to ask a question instead of simply accepting the demand. That question led to the documents. The documents led to the review. The review led to change. Rebecca believed she was sending a routine payment request to a homeowner who would eventually comply. Instead, she created the moment when an entire neighborhood started looking closer. And once people started reading the rules, the balance of power changed forever. Because authority does not come from confidence. It does not come from a title. It comes from following the standards that give that authority meaning. Several months after Willow Creek Estates withdrew the $1,800 assessment, the neighborhood looked almost exactly the same. The roads were still quiet in the morning. The lake behind my house still reflected the trees along the shoreline. The workshop my father built was still standing behind the house. The small dock he built years earlier was still reaching over the water. From the outside, it looked like nothing had changed. But inside the community, everything had. The biggest change was not the canceled assessment. It was the way homeowners viewed their own rights. Before everything happened, many residents believed that if a decision came from the HOA board, it must automatically be correct. The board had the title. The board had the responsibility. The board had always been the group making decisions. But after reviewing the documents and seeing the process unfold, people understood something different. Authority was not created by a position alone. Authority came from following the rules that created that position. I noticed that change during the next HOA meeting I attended. It was completely different from the meeting where Rebecca Caldwell first announced the assessment. Nobody arrived worried about another unexpected demand. Nobody sat quietly assuming there was nothing they could do. The board provided financial information before homeowners had to request it. Documents were available. Questions were answered directly. It was not dramatic. It was not a complete change overnight. It was simply a different way of handling decisions. But everyone noticed. Rebecca was still the HOA president. She still arrived with her leather folder and organized notes. She still carried the same responsibilities. But the way she approached those responsibilities had changed. When homeowners asked questions, she no longer treated them as a challenge to her authority. She treated them as part of the process. She explained decisions. She provided information. She allowed discussions before final votes. It was a different kind of leadership. A few weeks later, I met Michael Harrington for coffee. I thanked him for helping me through everything. I told him that when the first letter arrived, I never imagined it would lead to a complete review of how Willow Creek operated. Michael smiled and said something I remembered. "Daniel, most disputes are not really about the money. They are about whether people understand the rules that protect them." I thought about that while driving home afterward. The house looked exactly the same as it had for almost 27 years. The porch was still there. The workshop was still there. The trees my father planted were still growing. The memories were still there. But the relationship between homeowners and the HOA had changed. People realized they did not need to know every rule by heart. They did not need to challenge every decision. But they did have the right to understand what they were being asked to accept. That was the lesson I carried with me. The strongest response was never anger. It was never trying to overpower someone else. It was simply being willing to look closer. Because one document can change a conversation. One question can reveal a problem. And one homeowner who takes the time to understand the rules can remind an entire community why those rules existed in the first place. I still keep the original $1,800 assessment notice today. Not because I want to remember a disagreement. Not because I want to hold on to a victory. I keep it because it represents the moment I learned something important. My father always told me that documents mattered because they preserved the truth. Years later, those same documents protected the place he worked so hard to build. I placed the notice inside the same folder where I keep the records from my property. The same folder that contains my father's old agreements, receipts, and notes. It sits there as a reminder that ownership is not only about having a place to live. It is about understanding the responsibilities and rights that come with it. Rebecca Caldwell thought she was sending a routine payment request to a homeowner who would eventually comply. Instead, she created the moment when an entire neighborhood started reading the rules more carefully. And once everyone understood those rules, The outcome was no longer controlled by confidence or position. It was controlled by evidence. Because in the end, the HOA did not lose because one homeowner fought harder. It lost because one homeowner asked the question nobody expected him to ask. Can you show me where the rules give you this power?